system where someone's saying you ought to do this because we can do it. In an age in which you can do almost anything, the hardest question often is what you ought to do when you can do almost anything, or what you ought not to do when you can do almost anything. So the questions are harder, but we need to step up. You're right. That's what God calls us to, is to step up to the age we've been called to live in.
I was quite interested, Father, in your comments about the
I think you have to talk in that or they'll lose you.
I was quite interested in your comments about the professional military. Do you think a move toward the draft would be a step beneficial to the common good?
Well, there are those who make that argument. A former Massachusetts resident who makes it all the time is Mark Shields, Washington columnist and commentator, who argues that it's a better sort of expression of democracy that we share the two tasks of defense of the society and the promotion of the common good. But I must tell you that one of the reasons I think why the professional military do not want this to happen is that war is too complicated today. They have to be selective because it is a very, very demanding task to do much of what they are asked to do. Now, you know, to some degree, we've heard over the last couple of years that there's been slippage on that in terms of standards that they've kept because the force is so small. But on the whole, I teach at the War College in Washington. I've done it for 21 years. And as far as I know, there is no support in the professional military for a draft. There also is very little support in Congress because elected officials do not think this would be a popular thing to do. I guess my view is I'm willing to take the argument of particularly of the professionals that it takes a certain standard of performance that they need. So I think what we need to do is to be sure that as a country as a whole we keep in mind the sacrifice that a small part of the country bears whenever the question is the use of force. And I think that is an important kind of thing to both remember in different ways and pay tribute to. And as I say, you can do that if you deeply disagree with the policy that has sent people into battle. You can still respect the people who go, and so I think that's my best answer.
Thank you.
Father, on the issue of conflicts between the secular world and religious beliefs, which you touched on in a number of respects, would you care to comment on the debate regarding Notre Dame inviting President Obama as a graduation speaker?
Well, I don't know if I'd care to comment, but I'm up here, and so there isn't a lot you can do. I'm sort of not unconnected to this problem. It's been my privilege, really, over 40 years to go to Notre Dame virtually every year for a variety of purposes and lectures. I felt myself that the policy the bishops have about adopting who can be honored and not honored, it's a reasonable policy. I think it is probably in the end unworkable. And I think it's unworkable because in part the role of a university is to be in constant discussion with the wider society. Now, people say, well, you should invite them for a seminar. Don't invite them and give them a degree. And you can make that kind of argument. I think they did us a service by having it. I think partly this is a tradition. Notre Dame has invited every president since Eisenhower to address the university. And I myself think that it was a useful exchange. And there comes out of it a whole body of reflection and discussion that's still going on to this day. and will go on. And it will go on two different levels. One of the areas that I am deeply concerned about is, I didn't mention it because Father Hoy said you are not to talk as long as you usually do. So I was trying to obey my former student. But in the life issues, one of the questions that is crucial today is this conscience clause issue. This is fundamental. In a religiously pluralistic society, conscience clauses are part of the grease that keeps the engine going. Because what do conscience clauses do? Well, they say you make a policy for the country as a whole, presumably because it has widespread support. But there may well be religious groups in the country who, on the basis of their religious conviction, cannot participate in the policy. Now, again, to go to War and Peace, the classical case here is conscientious objection to warfare. And not in the beginning, we didn't honor it for a while, but certainly from the early 20th century on, we have made accommodation. When the security of the country was at stake, we made accommodation to conscience clauses of religious groups who oppose the use of force. Now, that kind of settlement, if you will, you make the law and policy for what the country votes for and supports, and you provide conscience clauses for religious objection. In War and Peace, actually, we now say that if you have moral objection without religious grounding, you still can get conscience clauses. But there is today, and has been for some time, over the last 5 or 8 years, an argument that conscience clauses are not good ideas, that they violate the rights of others. I think if we adopt that proposition, it is a fundamental mistake. Now, President Obama has talked about conscience clauses and what he would support and not support, and I heard him modify his position somewhat at Notre Dame in the face of a university where he knew that on a series of issues he was in deep disagreement with it. That's the kind of discussion we ought to have and need to have. So I felt it was a quite useful thing to do, but I know that I have a lot of folks who disagree with me, and some of them wear purple and red. So yes.
Father, you talked about the military and their objection to the draft. Did they ever discuss conscription? Because I know the Catholic universities and the Catholic colleges have encouraged their students to give. And I'm just wondering.
Yeah, well, conscription is, again, there is in place in the United States the potential to go from registration to a draft and to being called. That's not being done at the present time. But Catholic colleges and universities run ROTC programs. All of Notre Dame runs the largest ROTC program in the country, I believe. And Catholic colleges and universities do run ROTC programs. They also pair those ROTC programs with serious discussions about the ethics of war. Notre Dame, again, being one, Notre Dame put in place a very extensive program where all their ROTC candidates were obliged to deal with questions on ethics and war. So I believe the distinction between registration for the draft and having a draft is where we are at the present time. And on conscription, my sense is at the present time we will have a voluntary army, and it is useful, very useful, I think, to have ROTC programs so that the people who exercise command in the military are people whose background and understanding have been steeped in both not only political questions, strategic questions, but moral questions as well.
Father, I have a question about health care. My question is, I understand there's a moral obligation to provide health care,